Welcome to the April 2023 CLF Boston Northeast Reuse Group Subcommittee meeting. Today we'll be having a presentation from Lori Ferris on the CARE tool developed by Goody Clancy and AI 2030. To give a bit of background, in this reuse subcommittee, we're really looking to not only look at novel approaches and frameworks, but with the advent of different technologies, different softwares, how can we really leverage that in not only the design process, but all the way through the construction process to really make sure we're making the best decisions we can and incorporating reuse, whether that be adaptive reuse, whether that be material reuse. So we're very happy to have Lori with us today to walk through the tool and give some of her insight. I would say that if anyone has any questions, please save them to the end for a Q&A session, as well as after the presentation and Q&A, Laurel and I will go into a little bit of detail on kind of what we're hoping for the rest of the year, future meetings, and even potential homework for those of you who want to do it. Laurel, anything before we get to the presentation?
Nope, that's good. Thank you.
Perfect. So Lori, I'll hand it over to you and go ahead.
Great, thanks. Yeah, hi everyone. It's really nice to be here. I'm just going to share my screen. Share the right screen. All right, you seeing the slide deck? Looks like it. Great.
Yes.
Yeah, so I'm Lori Ferris. I'm a principal and director of sustainability and climate action at Goody Clancy. And I started working on this tool. I mean, I think it's been about 4 years at this point, and it's been a really collaborative effort. So I'm going to just kind of talk to you about the reason we developed this tool, the kind of gap in the landscape that motivated its development and the collaboration. But really, I just wanted to acknowledge the co-developers of the CARE tool. It is, as Michael mentioned, currently housed by Architecture 2030, and Larry Strain of Siegel & Strain Architects in the Bay Area was actually the sort of originator of the idea for this tool when one of his former employees, who now works for the UC system, they were doing their climate action planning at the sort of institution level, and they had this question he asked Larry, so we're trying to figure out how good it is for the environment if we reuse our existing buildings and upgrade them rather than just tear them down and replace them and build a bunch of new stuff. Where do I go to find out that number? And there wasn't any place to go. So that was sort of the driver that made Larry think, how can we start to quantify these environmental impacts of reuse compared to replacement? And then since then, it's been quite a journey. We launched the tool publicly at the end of last year. And it's currently available for public use, and we're still kind of evolving the tool and have plans for next steps, which I'll tell you about. All right, so this reuse analysis gap, again, this was, I think this group, you're really focused obviously on reuse and the carbon impacts, and I think specifically at a lot at the material and the salvage and the deconstruction level, but we're thinking at the whole building level. There's been a lot of development around life cycle assessment and carbon accounting, greenhouse gas inventorying, but none of it really accounted for existing buildings. So what we thought to kind of address is this old wisdom that the greenest building is the one that's already built. I think a lot of people have heard this. Many people kind of just understand this intuitively to be true. But we also have the numbers to show it. When we think about new buildings and the rate at which we're constructing, we know that the embodied carbon, the upfront carbon of new construction is very high. And when we're looking at needing to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 50% at least by the year 2030, and really to decarbonize by 2040, we know that we just don't have a lot of time to make up these upfront emissions from new construction. And when we look at operational emissions on top of that, we see the whole profile of buildings. And even if we're able to decarbonize their operations, we're still stuck with that high upfront carbon cost. We also know that existing buildings are responsible for the majority of greenhouse gas emissions, particularly in urban areas. For example, in Boston, over 70% of our greenhouse gas emissions come from our existing buildings. So we also have to think about how we're going to address these numbers. We're not going to do it by building new. We have to really think about our existing buildings and figure out how to mitigate their environmental impact, both reducing our energy use and through moving to fossil fuel free sources of power. And we know that most of these buildings are still going to be here by 2040. So by the time that we need to be net zero as a world, we have to, we somehow have to figure out how to address our existing building stock between now and then if we're going to actually hit our net zero target. So, we're coming back to this idea the greenest building is the one that's already built. We want to kind of shift our thinking about this and say that the greenest building is the one that's been retrofit, that we have to keep these buildings and we have to improve their performance. So this is where the CARE tool comes in. That's the point of the CARE tool. It's not an embodied carbon calculator, and it's not a whole building life cycle assessment tool. It's really a tool that kind of looks at both halves of the equation here, both the embodied carbon of construction of materials, both in the way we reuse buildings and in new construction, as well as the operational emissions. What are the emissions associated with buildings operating, existing buildings, the way they are, buildings as we're able to reuse them and reduce their energy use, and new construction. So this is just a list of collaborators. I mentioned this was a really collaborative effort. And I think one thing that makes the tool so powerful is that it had stakeholders engaged from the beginning that really kind of straddled a number of different corners of our building sector, including a lot of preservation and cultural heritage groups, and as well as kind of more sustainability focused groups and architects, obviously practitioners and consultants. So I think all of those voices have been represented in the development of the tool, which means that it's been a careful balancing act. How do we make it useful for all of these groups and provide enough detail so that it's applicable, really broadly applicable, but not so much detail that it's hard for many people to use, or that it's it's getting too far into the weeds. I'll talk about that a little bit. But essentially what the tool does is it evaluates total carbon emissions, embodied plus operational, of existing buildings compared to replacing with new construction. I just want to reemphasize again, this is not an energy modeling tool. It's not a detailed whole building life cycle assessment tool. And it doesn't allow for a lot of user overriding of inputs or very, very specific, specific inputs of information. And it is meant to really be used by a lot of people. It's meant to be an early level tool to ask that high level question about building reuse. So the idea is that it's not, it should be, it should be accessible to a lot of groups. It should be able to be used by planners who are trying to understand the importance of building reuse at the, at the neighborhood scale, at the city scale. It should be useful to heritage officers who want to understand, for example, what are the carbon benefits of historic tax credits and how can historic tax credits support state carbon neutrality targets. For educators, we've seen a lot of professors wanting to use this for their students to help them build up an intuition about embodied and operational carbon in buildings, and obviously for practitioners, for many other people. And I've already gotten into this a little bit, but what the tool is, it's pretty flexible actually. I think it can answer a lot of questions. And one thing I've heard from people who are experimenting with it are, I think I'm using it in a way it's not meant to be used, but ... And my response is it should be used in whatever way you think is useful to answer questions. This could be looking at a single building. How much carbon can I avoid by reusing this one building compared to replacing it? You can kind of experiment with some of the parameters around that. So what if, what if you're really, it's occupied and you can't do that much of an intervention to it, so you can only reduce its operational emissions by 50% or 25%. Then how does it look compared to, for example, a net zero new building? You can look at geography and grid intensity. Obviously, that those impacts matter a lot when we're talking about operational emissions. And then you can kind of scale this up and understand how existing buildings at the single building scale and then at the kind of campus or city scale can really support decarbonization goals in the built environment. I'm not going to get too far into data sources. I can if you have specific questions, but essentially this tool draws from a lot of existing data. Peer-reviewed published data. We use the Architecture 2030's Zero tool for operational emissions information, which pulls from eGrid and other CBEX, other national databases. We've used the Carbon Leadership Forum Embodied Carbon Benchmarking Study, which is, as you all probably know, being updated now. Use a number of other published benchmarking studies for embodied carbon, which are mostly focused on new construction, including those from CEOC for structural numbers. And then for some of the more detailed numbers, particularly around retrofit embodied carbon, we had to dig into some peer-reviewed papers, for example, to look at the embodied carbon of repointing or resealing windows, that kind of thing. So I'm just going to pause and say that I'm not reading chats right now. So Laurel or Michael, if you want to interrupt me with anything, please feel free. Or anyone else if you want to interrupt. Okay.
Please don't be distracted by the chats.
Okay. Great. So just looking at how this tool is put together, it essentially looks at 3 scenarios. It looks at an existing building if you don't do anything to it. It looks at reusing that building, and then it looks at replacing it with new construction. And within each of those options, you can just kind of see there are a number of different inputs around the building, just building general information. How big is it? What's it used for? Targets around energy use, energy improvement if you're retrofitting it, or just energy use if you have a new building. And then to determine embodied carbon, it looks at just kind of high-level inputs for the existing building around 4 major systems: structure, envelope, MEP, and interiors. And then for the new building, it's looking really at the primary structural system, which is the driver of embodied carbon for new construction, which is wood, a wood structure, a hybrid structure, or a kind of standard concrete steel commercial. And this is what it looks like in the interface. So on the left, you have all of your inputs, and then on the right, you have your outputs, and the output charts will sort of live update as you play around with the inputs. You can kind of experiment with different variables as you go. And just as I mentioned, it kind of runs through these scenarios. So first, there's some general information, which includes location and basically like where is your project, from which it gleans climate information. The second tab is about the existing building, defining it. How big is it? What's its kind of general composition? What's its structural system? What's it used for? The reuse scenario. Again, what are we doing to the existing building at a high level? Is there an addition? How much scope is there in terms of renovation? And what are we trying to achieve energy use? And then the new building can be the same. It could be different. For example, if you're, if you have a sort of medium-sized building that you might renovate, but if you tear it down, you're going to replace it with something twice as big. You could look at that to understand the carbon footprint of that parcel. And then in the end, these are the charts that come out. So on the top, you have total emissions for the selected duration, a time frame that you established, and on the bottom is looking at how those emissions play out over time. So you can kind of understand, at what point different decisions might be better or worse. So again, they're underlined in orange. We're seeing 17 years here, but this is a user-defined number. So this is sort of how long, what's the duration of the study? This could be, 17 years now would bring us to 2040. You could look at 7 years if you're interested by 2030, or you can kind of set your own date based on your, what you think is important. But we do advocate that you make it a small number, not 60 years, not 100 years, because we don't have time for that. What we really care about is what are the emissions that are going to impact our ability to stay below 2 degrees Celsius. So on the left, you can see what happens if you do nothing to the existing building. All the emissions are operational. In the middle is that reuse scenario. So we have, in this case, a reduced operational emissions because we've made the existing building more efficient, but we have some embodied carbon associated with the renovation. And then in the new building, again, we have the operational emissions. So in this case, it's a smaller bar, meaning it's even more efficient than the renovation. And then we have the embodied carbon, which is typically going to be a lot larger for a new building than it would be for a renovation because of all the materials going. And then on the bottom, we have our 3 scenarios shown over time. And you can just kind of see here the payback periods. I'm just going to highlight that in orange. This is essentially indicating that if you did nothing, that's the line in green, it would just operate it, the building would operate it as it always has. If you retrofit the building in dark blue, you have some embodied carbon in year 0, but that orange line happens at around year 1.5, which means that within a year and a half, the improved operational efficiency of this renovation has paid back the upfront carbon of renovation. As opposed to if you look to the new building, even over the 17-year time frame, the new building emissions are higher than the retrofitted building emissions, meaning that even when we look over time at a more efficient building, the new building isn't able to kind of overcome the penalty of the higher upfront embodied carbon compared to the renovation. I'm going to do just a little case study, but I think I'm going to do it live, easier to kind of understand. And it'll act as a little demo. But I'll just show you this building is here in Boston. It's the Boston University Admission Center, which we renovated in 2014. It is in a historic district. So while it was a comprehensive interior renovation, it was mostly a restoration of the exterior with some addition. It was what would be considered a deep energy retrofit. It included interior insulation, roof insulation, high performance glazing, as well as new high performance systems. But with the entire renovation, we were able to preserve and reuse 86% of the structure and enclosure and reduce the operational energy use by 70%. So let's see, I'm gonna try and maneuver my screen here. Okay. Yeah. This distracting. I think this will work. So you're seeing Care Tool now, is that right? Okay.
Yeah.
Great. So here's the interface. I'll just scroll up so you can see the whole thing. This is the interface. There's a user guide, which I think hopefully is useful if you're using this for the first time and provides some guidance about selections users can make. There's detailed data and methodology. If you're interested in where the data is coming from and how the calculations are working, our intention is to be completely transparent about that. And there's also this user feedback button. If there's something that's confusing or not working, we really want to know. Okay, the existing building is here in Massachusetts. I think it's not 02116, it's close enough. I'm going to use the default climate information and the default electricity grid emissions, but I'm going to come back to this because this is where you can look at the impacts of the greening of the grid, which can make a big difference. And I'll look from between now and 2030. So I then go into the existing building. It's about 18,000 square feet, 3 stories above grade, 1 below. And it was a kind of typical steel concrete structure. You can change the window to wall ratio if you have, for example, a historic building with 20% window to wall ratio, or if you have new construction that's completely glazed, you can kind of yourself. And this is college university use. I'm going to let it calculate a default energy use intensity for the existing building, although you can also enter your own here, including if you have utility, like utility bill data, you can enter that. And this is going to make an assumption about the total operational emissions of the building before we renovated it. We then go into the reuse tab. Here's where you can indicate if there was a large addition. Here there wasn't, so I'm going to leave that blank, or I'm going to say no. You can also indicate if there's a change of use associated with the reuse. In this case, there wasn't really, it's still college university. And then we can set our target. So as I mentioned, we reduced the operational, actually, this is not our EUI. The baseline's changed. Here we go. We achieved an EUI of 38, predicted EUI, energy use of 38 kBTUs per square foot per year. So you can immediately see as I enter this that over 7 years, we've saved a ton of carbon just by improving the building's efficiency. You can indicate if it's all electric or not. In this case, it was not. There were still gas boilers in the building. But you can also indicate renewables. If there were solar, on-site or off-site. So if there's solar, if you're purchasing renewables from somewhere else, you can indicate that. And then we do our embodied emissions. So again, this is in these four buckets: structure, envelope, interiors, and MEP systems. There wasn't very much structural work associated with this project. There's a little bit of reinforcing and some new openings. Close this up. And as you do as you input each one of these categories, you'll see it start to populate the embodied carbon intensity associated with each of these interventions. So for the exterior wall, I'm going to say it was a medium because we did repoint and clean and restore the entire facade. For windows and glazing, we did replace all of the windows. You can also select, weather stripping. There are kind of a range of options you can input here. And then for roofing, we replaced all of the roofing, which included insulation up to code. And we did insulate the walls. So that's our envelope embodied carbon. For interiors, there are 3 categories. You can look at these sum to 100% of the floor area. But within a building, there might be some areas where you're doing a restoration of existing finishes or just kind of cleaning and patching them up. There might be some areas where you just have new finishes, but you're leaving all the walls in place. And then there are other areas of the building where you completely reconfigure the inside. This would be kind of the gut renovation. So this was entirely a gut. And then for MEP systems, similarly, there's a small, medium, and large, depending on how much of the systems you're replacing. In this case, we replaced all of the building systems. And then there are also some modifiers. So, because we're trying to capture as wide a range of projects as possible, there are a number of factors that can impact embodied carbon that we couldn't really capture with all the drop-down options without making it too complicated. So you can check these boxes if you have low embodied carbon concrete, if you have responsibly sourced timber. So for example, FSC timber, if you're using a low embodied emissions envelope, this defines what that is, defines it, but essentially this will be a wood rain screen or a straw or hemp-based product, a natural product. And then high performance MEP systems, I'm going to click that. Essentially, if you're getting a really good EY, you should probably click this box. So that sums up my embodied carbon and gives me a total number, which you can see here. So this is the total carbon of the renovation, which is a little under 18 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent per square foot. And you can kind of look at that relative to the operational emissions. And it's, I think it helps develop an intuition about what are the operational emissions of these buildings relative to the embodied carbon of reuse or new construction. And you can also see that happening in the bar chart, that over this 7-year period, embodied emissions are maybe 40% of the total carbon, and the rest is still from operation. So I can continue. This tab's much easier. I'm going to leave the new building geometry the same as the renovated building, the existing building, just to compare apples to apples. I'll give it the same use type. Here's where you can kind of play around with the impacts of efficiency of the new building. So, if I make it, for the sake of argument, I sometimes like to make the new building more efficient than the existing building, because that's the argument we often get, is that a new building would be more efficient. It typically doesn't have to be that way, but just for the sake of argument here, I'm going to make it all electric because it would have to be now in Boston, but I won't give it any renewables yet. And then for the embodied emissions, I'll say it's steel and concrete, because I think that's most typically what it would be. And again, I'll give it those high performance MEP systems. So this is those are all the inputs. As I mentioned, the new building's much easier. And on the right, we can see that the new building has a much higher embodied carbon and a slightly better operational emissions number here. But over a 7-year duration, we can just see that relatively the new building is a lot higher. It's much more carbon intensive than reusing the existing building and making it more efficient. And you can also see how that plays out over time, that the carbon payback of the renovation is about 1.5 years. The new building would still pay back compared to doing nothing to the existing building. But if we look at the new building compared to renovation, obviously the new building is higher carbon than the renovation. And I'm just going to show you what it looks like to kind of toggle some of these assumptions. So, what if the new building were net zero? Then there are no operational emissions. When we look over time, this is all dark blue at the top. In this time, the chart that looks at emissions over time, you can see that the new building has flatlined. That's because there are no operational emissions, so it's just embodied up front, and that's it. But even if I click that number, even if I bring it to net zero, over this 7-year time frame, the renovation is still lower carbon than the net zero new building. So I'm going to put this back and just kind of show you a couple of other inputs you can toggle. It's interesting to look at the time frame of the study. If I'd made this 17 years instead of 7, you can imagine how the operational emissions start to play a much heavier role. It's a higher proportion of operational emissions because the upfront emissions still happen in year 0, and you're looking at a longer sort of play out of those operational emissions. So now if I make the new building net zero, you're going to see these lines cross at about 9 years. Put this back. And another, I mentioned the greening of the grid. You can enter your own grid decarbonization year, or you can use these pre-selected scenarios, which are based. There can be projections of how quickly our grids are actually decarbonizing based on our geography. And so you'll start to see a kind of curve full decarbonization is by the year 2050. You'll start to see these lines flatten out as the grid becomes green and emissions become cleaner, or emissions go to zero when the grid is cleaner. So I'll give you a few takeaways and next steps, and then I'll open up for discussion. We've been obviously playing around with the tool a lot and hearing a lot of feedback from people who are starting to use it. I think a lot of what we're finding from running the tool over and over are common sense things, right? That
of course. Well, you guys have a great day and a great weekend, and I'm sure I'll see you guys soon. All right.
Can people mute if you're not speaking? Thanks. So anyway, we know that reusing existing building is the greenest thing you can do, especially if you can make it net zero. If you can make a very high performance renovation, that will almost always be the lowest carbon option. But we know that just reusing buildings on its own is not enough to make it environmentally positive. We have to reuse the fabric, and we have to improve our energy efficiency and decarbonize the building's energy use. We also know that, as I mentioned, operational emissions matter the longer out you look. So I think it's critically important we know that we reduce our emissions in the very near term, which means those upfront emissions matter, but we also have to look over kind of the longer time frame. And we know that location and grid matter a lot. When you toggle those decarbonization years of the grid, you can really understand how the choices you make around how we reuse buildings, the outcomes will change a lot depending on how quickly our grid becomes decarbonized. Seismic upgrades, I didn't really show you that, but if you're in an area that requires intensive seismic upgrades, or if you have to do a huge amount of structural work, for example, if you're doing a facadectomy and calling that building reuse, that's not really reusing a building. You're going to lose a lot of the embodied carbon value if you lose the structure or if you lose the envelope. We also, we can see that this house compounds at the portfolio scale. That's been sort of interesting to see how these, obviously it makes sense. If you reuse one building, it has a pretty decent impact at that one building scale. But if you look at the potential impact over a precinct or campus, we start to see very high numbers and really, kind of large greenhouse gas implications. And then of course, carbon isn't the only metric that matters. The tool only measures carbon right now, but we know that that's just a very small focus. There are a lot of other, firstly, environmental impacts around water and biodiversity and materials extraction and just a plethora of other environmental impacts, but there are also social impacts. There are economic impacts, there are cultural and historical impacts. So I think that's another important thing, is that so we can't be so myopic and just measure this based on carbon, although carbon is obviously a very important metric, especially when we're trying to tie the benefits, the many co-benefits of reuse into the climate conversation in a real quantitative way. I'm going to end there and open for questions.
Thank you, Lori. To kick off questions, I actually had two. I know you had just gotten into this by saying that carbon isn't the only metric, but oh, whoopsie. But what do you think could be kind of added to this tool to make it kind of, you had said, looking at kind of the whole building perspective, what either going down the line would you want to use to refine it or kind of add in to make it more effective for all the stakeholders to use?
Yeah, that's a great question. So first, I just want to acknowledge that Olivia Wang is here from Goody Clancy as well, and she worked a lot on the data validation in the back end of the tool. So I might throw some questions to you as well, Olivia. Sorry, I didn't acknowledge you there earlier. But in terms of what's next, yeah, I think we have the developers had our own ideas about what would be next, and then the more as the tools become public, we've gotten so much feedback around different areas where people would like to use the tool that it's kind of it's perhaps skewing our direction or incentivizing us to go in other ways. But I think one thing I did mention a little bit is the social cost of carbon. Well, we get asked a lot about the dollar cost of these. Repeatedly, we are asked questions, can you incorporate financial outcomes into this tool, because that's what people care about? And we've just consistently said no, that's not the point of the tool, and it's very complicated and obviously fluctuates greatly during this economy, during any economy, is regionally specific. There's so many variables. It's just not, and it's also not what we're trying to prove. We're not trying to prove that something's cheaper than something else. The social cost of carbon is something else. The sort of community impact is something we're really interested in trying to capture. So I think that's the direction that we're looking in to go next in terms of expanding the outputs of the tool. The other, Michael, I think we talked about at the launch party, the importance of demolition impacts and salvage. I know this group cares a lot about that. Those numbers are also not in the tool now because a few years ago when we were bringing in all of the existing data, there just weren't really good solid numbers around those topics that we felt were kind of as validated as the other embodied carbon numbers. So that's certainly a direction that we're interested in expanding. The data within the tool is around demolition impacts and kind of material scale reuse impacts. We've also heard a lot of desire for single family residential, which the data in here is typically driven by commercial databases at this point. But we've had a ton of manufacturers, reps, homeowners, individual homeowners, and other groups, advocating that they want to be able to use it on homes because that's the majority of new construction is housing. So being able to look at that. What else? Sorry, we have a lot of ideas for next steps. Portfolio scale is another. That's a pretty big endeavor, but again, being able to provide a tool so that building owners, commercial real estate owners, campuses, et cetera, could look at their whole portfolio over time. And then geographic diversity. We've heard from a lot of people around the globe that they want to be able to use this tool and have it be applicable to their building stock. So that's also high on our priority list.
Awesome. We can open it up now to the group. We'll look through the chat, but if anyone wants to unmute or raise your hand, feel free to ask the question.
Sahidi?
Yeah, by all means.
Hi, Laurie. It was a great presentation, and we learned a lot about the reuse and the care tool as well. I'm Sahiti, and I'm currently working at Bayet, and we started our in-house research on reuse and deconstruction recently. So my question is, if when you're considering about carbon emissions for a new construction, are you considering that you're demolishing the existing building, and are the carbon emissions associated with demolishing the existing building also considered in the new construction?
Yeah, so that's what I was referring to previously, that we don't currently include the impacts of demolition in either scenario. Actually, early versions of the Excel tool did, but then we took them out because we felt like the data wasn't that good, and the percentage of impact we were seeing from demolition was actually quite small when you just look at the metric of carbon compared to the upfront emissions of the materials. But it's something we're interested in looking at.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Lori, to kind of add on to that real quick, there are a lot of estimates that they go into some of these either data sets or calculations. Is there a specific kind of either data set or metric you're looking at that through either kind of industry help, stakeholder help, could really refine and make the tool more impactful? We had mentioned kind of looking at demolition and building material that is going to landfill. But typically right now, I believe the EPA WARM calculator is the best way of going about that. And in that itself, there are a lot of estimates. Is there anything like that you can kind of pinpoint and say, if this were better, it would really help out?
I will say that one thing we spent a lot of time trying to assess and actually iterating on with the web app development was how to define those small, medium, and large descriptions of renovation in the in those drop down menus, like in the drop down and the sliders, trying to kind of define those buckets. So we did some stakeholder engagement around that, and I think as more people use the tool, we're interested in doing that again to really understand how are buildings reused across the country in different sectors, different building types. What are the right options with associated embodied carbon? That's a big challenge, how to define the embodied carbon of building reuse, because building reuse could be anything. It's not like new construction where it falls into neat buckets. So I think that was, that's one of the areas where stakeholder feedback was really useful in the first round, and I think will continue to be useful. Is how is the tool reflecting that the way that we're actually seeing buildings repurposed, repositioned, used, stored. Susan.
Thanks.
Hi.
So did you, for the example that you gave with the BU
Mhm.
library, was the tool used in decision-making prior? Like, for instance, when you said, like the interior was a gut job,
Yeah.
was that already decided on in the design, or were you, did you have these various goals and you looked at the tool to help you decide various aspects of the reuse of the building?
Yeah, that's a great question. That project is several years old. So the life cycle assessment and the care tool on that project were completely retrospective. So in that case, the answer was no. They did look at, I think often we have projects where the reuse is or demolition is considered, that it's not a sure thing that building is going to be reused. But I've never seen an owner be driven by embodied carbon as a decision-making factor. Frankly, even when we can show them the number, we have started to use it to present that information to owners now on current projects. It's still not a decision. I would say it's not a driver. It's, people I think are starting to factor it into their decision making, but I haven't seen it yet be the most important criteria. And I'm curious to know what other people on this call are experiencing, but I do think part of that has to do with policy, right? That climate action planning and climate policies typically don't include scope 3 emissions from buildings, don't include the embodied carbon. So there isn't really a justification to make decisions with that as a factor when it's not a criteria that's being, mandated.
Well, you're now making me think of another question, but if somebody wanted to react to that, because this is, and I'll just keep going then.
Go ahead, Susan.
So in terms of policy, having a tool, and I'm not going, this is all internal, discussions, that a tool that can become a standard and be defensible, when there's a lot of money involved and people are losing, might even want to take you to court because you promised this and, whatever. That is this type of tool something that is close to being a standard, or I don't know if you can even really say that, but
Yeah.
that, go ahead.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think it could be, and I know, for example, the state of California is working on their energy code and is considering requiring care tool as part of that evaluation. So I do think that it has the policy to be used as a compliance pathway within regulation or policy. I'm trying to think of others who are doing that. Oh yeah, I mean, Sarah Brannan's been recommending it at the federal level. So I do think it could be used for that. It's that, what's the saying, no tool is perfect, some tools are useful. So I think you kind of have to understand what you're trying to get out of it and have a clear idea of how the numbers are being used and some sort of quality control. But yeah, and I'm Suzanne, you have your hand up. I was curious, Barbara, though, because you mentioned the DCAM work, if you're able to unmute, how you see this fitting into a policy, and if you think that institution or that clients are willing to, or policymakers would be willing to kind of include this as a process.
I was really, first of all, using the tool was amazing, and it exactly met their expectations in terms of like what kind of data they needed. And this was a very politically loaded project. Initially, they wanted us to keep it completely confidential. So happily now they're allowing us to do a case study about it. But their intention from the beginning was to use the care tool on this project as a precedent to inform policy and what they're going to require in the future. We still haven't figured out what that will look like finally, but they are a little bit different than private sector, REIT developer or something like that, in terms of like what Susan was saying and how pissed off people might be about having to to do things. But definitely it is going to translate into policy for, they're going to define in what cases, what use cases it would need to be applied, and then best practices for using the tool, which of course will probably evolve as you're evolving the tool.
Great, thank you. Suzanne.
Suzanne?
Yeah, I have to say I kind of forgot my question, but I came up with another one. So no, it's Friday. You know how it goes. And you might have covered this, Laura. It's only because this has just been coming up recently. So
Yeah.
I love the tool. I will echo what Barbara's saying in that this is that macro looking to help frame things, kind of order of magnitude. Once you get past that, so I'm looking at the care tool taxonomy, is you put in your target energy use. So from the operational, and I think that's great because we can start correlating that with like the BUTO and BERTO requirements that we're going to have to start meeting and start saying, hey, let's design to what that's going to be. So that's a great tool to kind of help for that. Does it have like take into account and I feel like Goody Clancy, you guys are like the expert in the industry of historical, renovations and stuff, of how to actually achieve, like you can put in a target, but then how do you actually get everything, especially around the envelope, you're having to look at more and more. And then there is such a spectrum on like insulation types in the body carbon relative to what some of your situations might be.
Yeah, that's a great question. It currently doesn't not provide guidance. I'll say it that way. That's something that we've considered, trying to point people towards. The user manual, we do kind of try and point out, for example, if you say that you're getting a net zero building, but you should also, you should also say that you're upgrading the envelope and you're doing something to the MAP system, right? Like you can't, we're trying to kind of prevent users from falling into those traps. But there's nothing built in that says, that kind of suggests paths to get to a certain point. We have talked about, we are planning to build out a case study tab. The tab is there, it's not populated, to kind of illustrate different ways that you can achieve different pathways. But I think that is a really good point, that many users of the tool would need some help. They might say, we have this energy goal, but how can we meet it? In terms of specific installations, we assume mineral wool is kind of a middle of the road application. Obviously, it would vary a lot depending on what you select and depending on the thickness of insulation. So that's kind of described in the data and methodology. So you have, even though you can't change the tool's inputs, you can kind of play around with it on your own. That's again something that you could explore in another tool after this. And I think that's another thing we've been talking about, is mapping where this falls into a workflow. So there are, the early stage tools that won't necessarily let you look at those refined inputs, but they help make the big picture questions that make the very large carbon impacts. And then it kind of filters into a more detailed tool like Kaleidoscope, which is actually used to inform the numbers in here, but it might go to Kaleidoscope for envelope, or it might go to, the ETSI 2050 tool or something to kind of look at different systems.
That's a good point. Yeah, you can kind of integrate those.
Yeah.
And my last question, and I'll hand it over to Jean, is with the new, this tool I'm sure is being used across the world, but in our backyard here with the new stretch code, is there like potential guidance that you guys are thinking about putting together? Any recommendations of, because I feel like you can put into the tool somehow potentially, like if you're touching the envelope, then you're triggering the stretch code requirements for the envelope, whether it be prescriptive or something like that. Is there an easy way to kind of correlate that and start understanding, to get that more specific to a regional requirement?
Yeah, we certainly don't have that programmed in at this point. It's meant
I wouldn't assume you would.
national. Yeah, that could be a sort of interesting blog post article or something of like the implications. Yeah, the other thing we've been thinking about using it for with the stretch code is just to kind of illustrate the potential, I don't know, Jean, this might have to do with what you're saying, but the huge carbon bubble we're going to cause, and the potential loss of historic and existing buildings that's going to be triggered by the stretch code and you know, kind of be able to illustrate quantitatively that these stretch code requirements don't actually make sense from a carbon standpoint. If you look out by 2050, we're going to spend more carbon than we're saving to tear out historic windows and put in triple glazed or what have you. So I will be interested to see how it can help tell that story. That is a good point, Suzanne, about how we can, you know, if there's a way to provide guidance about the implications of codes. It could be, and it could be that the guidance is applicable not just to Massachusetts, but in terms of considering the own, you know, your own jurisdiction's requirement. Jean.
I wasn't going to do my standard rant.
Oh, okay. I did it then. Did it for you.
But I was curious in your work with the Climate Heritage Network and following what's going on around the world, how is, I would say maybe UK is moving more quickly than some. Are they, do they prescribe the tools you have to use in order to do a carbon accounting on their buildings? Do you know?
That's a good question. I don't think that they're prescribing the tool. I know that they have LCA guidelines. So there are guidelines. I don't believe that they prescribe the tool itself. Yeah. But that's no, I don't think so. And I know that I did see that ASHRAE's just put out a public comment period for their life cycle assessment, whole building life cycle assessment guidelines, which would be the first guidance in the United States for that.
Anyone have any final questions? Okay. Well, thank you, Lori, for presenting on the CARE tool. Like I said in the intro, tools like this that kind of can provide a very simple data set and really show the impacts, I think will be very important going forward with the kind of radical decarbonization that the built environment is going to need. So thank you. We appreciate it.
Thank you all.
Moving forward, just wanted to, in the last 10 minutes, give some updates on the CLF review subcommittee and go through some items. This morning, there was a larger CLF Boston New England hub meeting. I'll look to share my screen, but just to go through a few items. Do I know how to share my screen? How many times are we doing this? There we go. To go through this, the CLF website is live. For those of you who have not checked it out yet, while there will need some further refinement, you can go to clfboston.com and check it out. We have pages for the different working groups you can see up here. We're looking to start including events such as this subcommittee meeting monthly into it as well. And really just hoping to really build this out. As you can see, the case studies right here brings us to our next point. If you have any case studies, whether it's a project that is incorporating manufacturer take-back programs, any site separation, salvage, reuse, deconstruction, this group and CLF Boston Northeast wants, we want to help you. We want to look to develop case studies. Really, even if there are major lessons learned, we hope to use this as an important tool, much like I was just saying with the CARE tool spitting out very understandable and digestible data to really show that reuse, deconstruction, adaptive reuse are things that we need to continue to push and make the strongest case possible. So if you do have any of those, or you know a project at your firm or that you've helped out with, please let us know. Moving on, policy has quickly become something that is very much going in a good direction, you'd say, in Massachusetts, but definitely needs industry support and help. The one that immediately comes to mind when looking at reuse is a bill currently in the House. It is Bill H.833, and really looking at extended producer responsibility. Not every material that is going into a space is going to be able to be reused or recycled, but having California and Europe as really leaders in this. How can extended producer responsibilities and things such as manufacturer take-back programs help out a circular economy? It's through bills like this and continued use. And I would say, similar to that, with the plethora of different embodied carbon bills that are going through the legislature in mass right now, there are some events. If you are interested in this at all, to learn more, MCAN and the CLF policy group have been really collaborating to try to get as many practitioners in the know to either speak out or really defend and be a partner on this legislation. So there are various events, including this one that you should all see, on your screen. So if you're interested at all, please reach out to us. We can send you links. We'll look to send the links out in the meeting minutes as well that go out next week. But there are several different ways for you to get involved if this is something you want to be part of. Lastly, going through with major updates, we are looking for different meeting and presentation ideas going forward, whether it's looking at, we mentioned a bit today, historic preservation and adaptive reuse, it being a priority to different municipalities, maybe having an in-person charrette, and then really much like the case studies, if there is a project that you have or worked on that achieved a circularity goal or you want to talk about, we'd love to host you. And really just looking to demonstrate impactful and reuse behaviors and frameworks that really added to the project or an owner recommended or really required. The last thing I'll say with a few minutes here is that I know this is a bit unorthodox, but for homework, something that might be worthwhile for anyone who takes a look at waste and waste reports is to put a little bit more scrutiny into them. So I have just documented here, I pulled it from the reports to keep everyone anonymous, but the sheet you're seeing right here, this was a waste report that was provided on not even a lead job. It was requested to say what was going on, what's coming back, because the owner, who happened to be Boston Properties, is pushing forward with understanding more about their waste and the impacts of their waste. We've seen this through several different kind of owners making bold claims, whether it's through their ESG goals, but in asking for waste and having requirements, the first report we got for the first 3 halls stated commingled and was 75% across the board. In looking in on that and asking for a bit of scrutiny and backup, it was determined that there was none. There are a lot, I think, in getting to circularity and getting to zero waste right now, very, very difficult with how the frameworks and structure of projects are set up. But to get there, transparency is needed across the board. So after looking through everything, eventually this bottom chart right here for the same 3 halls were amended. You'll see there that the percentages are just a bit different, but this is what can be verified. This is what can be pulled out from the facility reporting out. So I would ask as homework, if you want to take a look, if you are on the contractor side, if you are on the design side and you have a lead project or a project that's reporting out, to just take a little bit more scrutiny and just to be curious enough to ask where the data is coming from. Some processors such as ReRox or Resource Roxbury will present that data and be able to take that, but for others who do not, where are we getting this data from? Because only through transparency and actual reporting can progress happen. Just wanted to share that as something that rocked my world. Laura, I'll open up to you if you have any last thoughts.
No, I think I'm sad that Allison jumped off. I don't know if that, Lori, that's why I said don't worry about the chat, because Allison was saying she had to go and it's her birthday. So we'll have to wish Allison a happy birthday, but a timely question, I guess, for the group. And certainly, even if you're joining for the first time and you're interested in joining this group more in the future, feel free to respond. But certainly for those who've been part of this group for a while, we're called the reuse subcommittee, and we've been, since our inception, really focused more on like material reuse and less on whole building reuse and adaptive reuse at that scale. And I would say that that's not intentional. It's just been, a bit of it has been by virtue of the types of projects that like Michael and I work on most often and the scale of projects. But it's not like this, just because we're co-chairing this group doesn't mean that it's, it's only self-serving to an extent. We want it to be inclusive and, meet the needs of the broader Boston market. So I feel like, there's certainly a miss in just focusing in on that like material level reuse. And so this was a timely presentation, Lori, to have you come in and talk about the whole building reuse question. And I know Michael and I want to loop in with Allison a bit more. She's been bringing up the idea about having like a design charrette, bringing together, connecting with the policy group seeing what's reuse policy, where do we intersect with the CLF policy group. So I think I'd love to just see whether you want to like raise your hand, drop a comment in the chat if you want to say anything, or just use the reaction tool on Zoom. Like are folks, is it a thumbs up or I don't care about talking about whole building reuse? Like, would you guys like to hear more of that kind of adaptive reuse conversation and discussion in this forum? I see a couple thumbs ups. I don't see any thumbs downs, so that's good. Awesome.
I think it's super relevant, Laurel.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Cool. Hopefully that'll also help us, diversify some of the, content and guest speakers that we're bringing. I feel like we, always get some good discussions going in this group, and would absolutely love, Catherine, I know you had shared a project case study with us last year. We'd love to get more, give more opportunities for folks who are part of this group to share what they're working on. And it doesn't always have to be the, poster child, look at all the great things we accomplished. I've been kind of saying this to a lot of folks lately, like it's really helpful, especially as we're talking about reuse and carbon. It's helpful for us to have the data to present and allow people to start to visualize those impacts. And so even if we're saying, hey, here's a project that we just tracked, the impacts on, we weren't able to, do everything we wished we could do, but, take a look at the numbers, take a look at the data and see what the impact was, because so often, we don't have the time and we don't take that effort on projects to capture and report that out. And we miss that learning and that opportunity. So that's my piece.
In presenting that case study, I also started to question that data myself, Michael, and I definitely would have loved some more backup to those diversion rates, because I scrutinized them a bit as I was presenting, and I definitely don't think that we hit those targets, unfortunately. So yeah, that was interesting to see you present that, and I'll be looking for better ways to verify that data in the future, even if it's not a lead project.
Yeah.
Yeah, really just staying curious and asking questions. I think I mentioned, but in the project presentations and the case studies, what have you, lessons learned are critical. Clearly, we have not achieved the circular economy that we all know can be out there, and by only showcasing the diamonds in the rough or the unicorn projects, while it's important to know that, hey, this and that worked, right now we need a reference guide of what didn't work. So very, very critical to know that as well. It is 2 o'clock, so we'll look to get off. But just as a reminder, meeting minutes will go out next week with the recording. We'll share some links and a quick recap along with the kind of official notes. But once again, wanted to thank Lori Ferris and Olivia and Jean for being here from Good Clancy and showing off the CARE tool, and for everyone coming today.
Thank you all. Have a great weekend.
Thanks,
Thank
everybody.
you. This was great. Yeah, thank you.
Everyone.
The CARE tool is amazing. Thanks for all your work on this, Lori and company.
Yeah, Lori.
Great job.